Welcome, everyone.
Hey, everybody, I think we'll get started. So we're very happy to have presentation today, and we've got construction on both sides of the building. A little bit of interest, giant cranes and things of that nature. That's kind of cool. So Taj today is going to give us Master of Forestry presentation, and then afterwards there'll be some questions, some time for questions from anybody. But after that's all over, then unfortunately everybody gets to leave, and then his committee and Taj to have a little longer discussion. But please ask some questions at the end of the talk. Taj grew up in Petaluma, so he's a local guy. Got his BS degree in CRS, Conservation Research Studies, in 2017, right here at Berkeley. He's had quite a bit of work experience already, Point Blue, the NRCS, Sonoma Land Trust, among others. And he's actually working on his burn boss certification for a private burn boss, which is pretty cool. He's been at it. So with that, I'll turn it over and good luck.
Cool. Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. Like Scott said, I'm Taj Katuna, Masters of Forestry student here, and I'll be presenting today on my graduate research project looking at prescribed fire effects in southern coast redwood forests. I'm going to spend about 45 minutes talking, and then take the last 15 minutes or so for questions and conversation. For folks on Zoom, there's quite a few of you. Wow, welcome. 70-some people, and we got a full room here too. So yeah, thanks so much for being here. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll get to them at the end. Just for all of your reference, we're coming to you today from the UC Berkeley campus, which sits on Huchun, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo Ohlone people. So before really jumping into it, I just want to give you a sense of what I'll be touching on today. I'm going to start with some background on coast redwood forests south of Mendocino County, discussing the historic fire regime of coast redwoods and how historic conditions compare to those of modern day. I'll also touch on some existing research on prescribed fire effects in these forests. I'll then move on to introducing our research questions, study area methods, and also share results of our observed prescribed burns and how they compare to modeled prescribed burns that we modeled in the Fire and Fuels extension of Forest Vegetation Simulator. I know there are a lot of forest managers and fire practitioners on the call today too, so I'll be paying particular attention to how our findings, like what implications they have for stewardship using fire moving forward. So any discussion about the use of fire in an ecosystem must first be grounded in an understanding of the historic fire regime for that plant community. And that means the severity, the frequency, and the seasonality in which fire burned. This table shows tree ring fire history studies in coast redwoods south of Mendocino County. In this region, coast redwoods are defined by frequent fire. The mean fire return interval is approximately every 15 years, though it ranges from every 6 to 30. Fire occurrence generally increases across 3 geographic axes, becoming more frequent in eastern inland sites and higher elevations that experience less summer fog, and more frequent in southern portions of its range, which get less winter precipitation. Fire predominantly burned in fall and winter months, though, as with any forests characterized by frequent fire, the occurrence of fire really varied across space and time in response to other ecological processes, as well as cultural practices, vegetation composition, and microsite conditions. So it's also important to understand the source of these fires on the landscape. And in the case of redwoods in this region, there's simply not enough lightning in the Central Coast Range to account for the high frequency of fire scars shown in those studies. So as such, we know that these fires were intentionally lit by indigenous peoples. And this evidence provided by those fire scar studies is affirmed by indigenous knowledge and oral histories of Coast Miwok, Pomo, and other indigenous peoples on the Central Coast, which describe the frequent intentional use of low to moderate severity fire for a wide range of ecocultural and spiritual reasons. Despite interruptions to the transmission of indigenous knowledge through the dispossession of land and the criminalization of burning practices, despite that, Indigenous leaders and cultural fire practitioners maintain what's been termed Indigenous fire sovereignty. That is the right and responsibility to use fire in self-governed, culturally specific and place-specific manners. These settler colonial forces have created conditions in which redwoods are now what we consider ignition limited. That means that the alterations to their historic fire regime are driven more by the exclusion of fire rather than the suppression of new fire starts. And it's this recognition that really necessitates the active use of fire in future stewardship and restoration efforts, as well as necessitates the restoration of Indigenous access to land and fire. This frequent fire regime likely produced low severity fire effects and maintained relatively low surface fuel loads, open forest structure with a variety of tree species and age cohorts, and a diverse understory community of various shrubs, forbs, and grasses, many of which are important food sources for Indigenous people. More broadly, this frequent fire also maintained a heterogeneous mosaic of different native plant communities around redwood stands, and those include coast prairie, oak woodland, mixed hardwood forest, coastal scrub, and others, all of which were stewarded through the frequent use of fire. The removal of Indigenous burning, along with legacy timber harvesting and subsequent fire suppression policies, have now significantly altered these forest conditions. And these forests are now generally characterized by high stand densities, high fuel loads, and sparse understory communities. These dense second and sometimes third growth redwood forests are composed mostly of small diameter redwood trees that originate from basal resprouts after timber harvesting, along with less dominant Douglas fir, tan oak, and other hardwood species. Fuel loads of duff, litter, and coarse woody debris are especially high due to slow decomposition rates of redwood. And while it's difficult to quantify, we think that redwood stumps are also large sources of surface and ground fuels and likely contribute to fire intensity in these forests as well. Other disturbances such as drought and sudden oak death also intensify many of these forest and fuels conditions. But assuming these forests have a mean fire return interval of about 15 years and have gone conservatively 70 years without fire, that means that many redwood forests in this region have now missed 4 to 5 fire events, which constitutes an ecologically meaningful disruption in their fire regime. And it's really these forest and fuels conditions that have set the stage for recent large wildfires in these areas, including the 2020 Walbridge fire and the 2020 CZU lightning complex fire, both of which had large patches of high severity fire effects, which is atypical of those historic fire regimes. At the same time, however, many nonprofit organizations, prescribed burn associations, and government agencies like California State Parks are increasing the use of prescribed fire in coast redwoods to steward these forests in and around the Bay Area. And it's these prescribed burns in this area that provide researchers an opportunity to study the short and long-term effects of fire and provide meaningful feedback to managers that is specific to their site. So prescribed burning is becoming more common in this region in large part because land managers are recognizing the need for more common because of the need for active management of these forests to restore mature forest conditions. Despite the intent to protect ecosystems, forest preservation efforts, when paired with fire suppression policies, have proven ineffective at maintaining the ecosystem resilience of these forests. And while it takes centuries to develop mature redwood forest conditions, there are some short-term objectives that managers can aim for, including reducing surface and ground fuels, reducing stand density, and increasing structural heterogeneity within and among stands, as well as increasing understory diversity and more broadly moderating future wildfire severity. There are a few tools that managers have to work towards these goals, the first being mechanical treatments such as thinning and mastication, which can minimize the severity of wildfires by reducing stand density and canopy bulk density, but are often limited in this region due to high economic costs, limited forest products facilities, and in some ways societal objections. People don't love cutting down redwoods in the Bay Area. And they also don't necessarily address fuels issue or surface fuels issues, but for non-industrial forest managers, prescribed fire may provide a financially and logistically viable option to meeting many of these restoration goals. I will also point out that recent legislation and liability protections around the use of cultural fire also support and facilitate tribes and cultural fire practitioners in restoring these conditions, as well as meeting their own suite of specific ecocultural restoration goals. So while research on this topic is somewhat limited, there are two primary papers that provide useful insights into post-treatment conditions. The first is Kalman and Russell's 2021 paper in the Journal of Fire Ecology, which is a study from old-growth redwood forest in Big Basin State Park in Santa Cruz. And they analyzed longer-term changes in fuel loads, forest structure, and understory species composition after prescribed burn treatments, comparing unburned plots to those that burned 8, 12, and 20 years prior. The second paper is a case study led by Eamon Engber in 2018, it's the one on the right there, which looks at forest and fuels conditions after 3 prescribed burns in Redwood National Park in Humboldt County. The burn treatments in this study were conducted at low, moderate, and high intensity in areas with high stand density and had been relatively unmanaged for the last 40 to 45 years. So when it comes to fire effects on forest conditions, both of these studies found a slight reduction in tan oak density in basal area and variable responses in Douglas fir. They also found little change in redwood overstory density and basal area, despite the fact that redwood had some of the highest scorch heights and bull char heights. Low intensity fire appears to have little effect on forest structure and composition because most of the tree mortality is concentrated in smaller size classes, smaller than roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, which is about 12 to 15 inches. When we look at fuels dynamics in these studies, both of them observed a reduction in litter and fine fuels, though they appear to rebound to pre-treatment levels within about 7 years of burning. Engber's paper found some variability in coarse woody debris loads due to tree fall in the years following the treatments. Theoretically, higher intensity fire will kill more overstory trees, leading to a greater recruitment of coarse woody debris as those limbs and snags fall over time. Kalman and Russell found significant reduction in coarse woody debris in their plots, though they didn't look at fire intensity as part of their study. This suggests that while prescribed fire can reduce surface fuel loads, fuels dynamics after burns are somewhat nuanced and fluctuate with fire intensity and overstory mortality. Taken together, low intensity fire appears to have little effect on forest structure, and the fine fuel reduction benefits appear to be somewhat short-lived. Moderate to higher intensity fire is more likely to reduce stand densities, but could have the unintended effect of increasing coarse woody debris loads over time. Overall, these studies also suggest that a single burn treatment can't address both forest structure and fuel reduction goals in the long term, hence that continued repeated use of fire is needed into the future. Forest and fire managers who use prescribed fire also often rely on fire behavior modeling software to predict things like fire behavior, fire effects, and fuel treatment effectiveness in mitigating future wildfire intensity. The Fire and Fuels extension to Forest Vegetation Simulator, which I will simply refer to as FFE from here on out, is a stand-level forest growth and yield modeling software often used to estimate the effects of various forest treatments over time, including thinning and prescribed fire. Most commonly, FFE is used to predict how forest treatments will mitigate wildfire hazard, especially in hot, dry, windy conditions when fire behavior is likely to be most intense. But as best as we can tell, there has not been an assessment of model performance yet for prescribed fires under cooler, wetter conditions in redwoods. And as a result of the limited empirical research on this topic, like I just mentioned, there has been no formal assessment of FFE outputs in these settings. But such assessments have been conducted for dry conifer forests in California, and those studies found that post-treatment litter and fine woody fuels were not well predicted. So building on the existing research and this clear need for FFE accuracy assessments in redwoods, our study sought to answer 3 primary research questions that are relevant to fire and forest managers. First, we analyzed the observed effects of 2 prescribed burns on forest and fuels conditions. And then second, we used that field-based data to test the accuracy of modeled prescribed fire effects using FFE. And finally, we asked whether these observed prescribed burn treatments reduced future wildfire intensity. So to answer these questions, we analyzed 2 prescribed fires at 2 different study sites. The first was at the Grove of Old Trees near Occidental in Sonoma County, and the second was at Wilder Ranch State Park near the town of Santa Cruz. Both sites are dominated by coast redwood and Douglas fir, with a mixed subcanopy of bay laurel, tan oak, madrone, and several oak species. Understory vegetation communities are generally sparse with patchy distributions of ferns, California blackberry, poison oak, California hazelnut, and various forbs. The management history of these sites is typical for coast redwoods in the Central Coast, at least, that are managed for recreation and conservation values as opposed to timber production. Though there is evidence of timber harvesting at both sites in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There has been no recent forest or fuels management at the Grove of Old Trees in the last 30 years, but some of the plots at Wilder Ranch were treated with a prescribed fire in November of 2005. There's also no recorded history of wildfire at either site in the last 100+ years. We utilized a stratified standardized sampling method and installed 12 plots at Wilder Ranch and 8 plots at the Grove of Old Trees. All of the plots were treated with a prescribed broadcast burn, and we did not use any control plots as part of this study. I did also want to put up the burn objectives for both of these burns as defined by the burn plans, and that was to reduce surface and ground fuels, kill Douglas fir seedlings and saplings, reduce stand density while limiting the mortality of those large mature redwoods, and reduce the threat of wildfire to neighboring communities, because both burns were actually conducted adjacent to communities. So these are in many ways WUI prescribed burns. The stratified sampling design and field data collection protocols we used come from CAL FIRE's prescribed fire monitoring program. And each plot was a 10th acre circular plot in which we inventoried all trees over 3 inches in diameter. We conducted ocular estimates of understory vegetation cover and recorded the slope, aspect, and canopy cover in each plot. We also installed 4 Brown's fuels transects in each of the cardinal directions, and finally recorded the species count and height of all seedlings, saplings, and resprouts within a smaller subplot, which was 1/70th of an acre. During burn operations, we recorded fuel lengths, ignition patterns, and collected fuel moisture samples at the Grove of Old Trees, but we did not collect samples at Wilder Ranch. The weather data we use comes from nearby PG&E utility weather stations, roughly 1.5 miles from both units. And that data was recorded every 10 minutes during the burn operations. Now, we used this weather station data as opposed to on-site weather observations because it maintained consistency between these 2 sites, which geographically are pretty far apart. And it provided us nighttime weather observations when FEMO resources on site were not collecting weather observations at the unit. To assess the accuracy of modeled fire effects, we used FFE to model a prescribed fire treatment in each of our 20 plots. This is just a schematic that shows the conceptual workflow we used, as well as the FFE output tables that were generated for comparison to our observed data. It's in the bottom box. Model inputs included all of the pre-treatment tree and fuels data, as well as fuel moisture and weather observations from the burn operations to ensure that modeled conditions exactly match our observed conditions. And we compared modeled post-treatment outputs to observed post-treatment data in order to test the model accuracy in predicting flame length, scorch height, change in fuel loads, and forest structure and composition, as well as tree regeneration dynamics after the burns. All statistical analyses and data visualization was performed on RStudio with an alpha level of 0.05 used to determine statistical significance. Welch's t-tests were used to compare observed pre-treatment and observed post-treatment conditions including overstory tree density and basal area for each species, seedling, sapling, and resprout densities, fuel loads, and the probability of torching, which was our measure of treatment effectiveness. T-tests were also used to compare the same variables between observed post-treatment and modeled post-treatment data sets. While we collected understory vegetation data, like I mentioned before, we did not analyze that as part of the study. We also created a linear regression model for the change in litter and fine woody debris after the observed burn treatments. The full suite of independent variables that we considered included slope, aspect, pre-treatment fuel loading, stem densities for overstory trees, as well as seedlings, saplings, and resprouts for each species. We used the random forest package to reduce the number of independent variables to a parsimonious list by generating mean decrease accuracy scores for all of the variables, and then only selected those with positive scores, which you'll see here in a moment. Model variables were also tested for normality within the data and residuals using Shapiro-Wilks tests and density distribution plots. So onto our burns. The burns were conducted in November of 2022. I just wanted to put these photos here to give you a sense of what fire behavior looked like. This is from the Grove of Old Trees burn. And you can see flame lengths are generally 1 to 2 feet, maybe slightly larger in areas with fuel jackpots, but generally it was pretty low intensity, low intensity fire. This is a table showing the weather and fuel moisture conditions for both of the burns. And as you can see, they were conducted under pretty similar conditions. We had temperatures ranging from 45 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity was typically around 50%, with drier periods in the afternoons and wetter periods overnight, as would be expected. 20-foot winds were generally under 5 miles per hour, with some gusts up to 15. Fuel moistures at the Grove of Old Trees were generally wet, with fine dead fuel moisture ranging from 12 to 50%. And duff and coarse woody debris were wetter, as would be expected. While we didn't collect fuel moisture samples for Wilder Ranch, we surmised that fuel moisture was likely slightly drier than the Grove of Old Trees, given the slightly longer time since rainfall. You can see that it rained 10 days prior to the Grove of Old Trees burn, but 17 days prior to Wilder Ranch. And I also wanted to put up the burn prescription here as defined by the burn plan. This is the desired conditions and then the cool conditions. And generally the observed weather and fuel conditions fall between those desired and cool parameters. So as would be expected, we saw low intensity fire. So looking at the effects of these observed burns, we found very few overstory trees were killed in the prescribed burns. Most overstory mortality occurred in redwoods under 25 centimeters in diameter. That's about 10 inches. And because of this, there was no real change in basal area or relative dominance for any species. We can see this in the large graph on the right, which shows pre and post-treatment tree densities by size class. Redwoods are shown in orange, and all other species are grouped together and shown in blue. Understandably, seedlings and saplings were more susceptible to fire, which we see in the graph in the bottom center and bottom right. And the graph on the bottom left shows that nearly all of the species were vigorously resprouting after the burn. That is, except for Douglas fir, our only non-sprouting species. This prolific resprouting is especially the case for redwood, and we saw a significant increase from 657 stems per hectare before the burn to 3,371 after the burn. Those are the mean values. Turning to fuels now, we observed a significant reduction in duff and litter, both of which were reduced approximately 50%. Fine woody fuels, that is 1, 10, and 100-hour fuels, remain unchanged. Most of the rotten 1,000-hour fuels were reduced, but sound 1,000-hour fuels actually increased slightly. Given this, the reduction in surface and total fuels was primarily driven by the reduction in litter and duff. And these findings are consistent with the past research, as you'll remember, which saw, in some cases, increases in coarse woody debris. In this case, the slight increase in woody fuels could be due to a lack of consumption during the burn, but could also be due to post-treatment canopy fuel deposition. In the winter of 2022 and 23, we had 9 large storms, 9 atmospheric rivers affect both sites, which resulted in several periods of very high winds. These storms occurred after the burns were implemented in November, but before we collected post-treatment data in June, and likely deposited a considerable amount of woody fuels on the forest floor. And unfortunately, because we didn't collect our data immediately after the treatment, we can't really parse out whether these marginal changes in woody fuels is due to a lack of consumption or storm-related deposition. But to give you a sense of what it looked like, this is a before and after photo from a plot at Wilder Ranch. Before on the left, after on the right. You can see much of the litter and duff around the base of that big redwood was consumed, but there are some 10 and 100-hour fuels still there on the ground, some of which are charred, some of which are not. There's also some smaller trees in the background that have been top killed and are now resprouting, and obviously forbs and grasses are quickly bouncing back. We found that the best predictor of change in litter and fine woody debris was the pre-treatment total fuel loads. And looking at our random forest importance plot here on the bottom left, our independent variable selection for the model found that pre-treatment loads of litter, surface, and total fuels had the strongest influence on model accuracy. Now, as you would expect, there is strong collinearity between those 3 variables, so we only selected one, and that was the one with the highest score, total fuels. I should note we opted to make a simple linear regression in this case, as opposed to a mixed effects model, because of our limited sample size of only 20 plots. Model results reveal that there is a significant relationship between these 2 variables. This means that as pre-treatment, here, let me describe the graph actually first. The graph on the right, the x-axis shows pre-treatment total fuel loads, and the y-axis shows the percent change in litter and fine woody debris after the burn treatment. And what this model is showing us is that there's a significant relationship between those two variables. And this means that as pre-treatment total fuels increases, there's a greater reduction in litter and fine fuels after the burn. And this is consistent with past research from dry conifer forest in California, paper led by Jacob Levine that found the exact same relationship. And one way to make sense of this is that as total fuels increase, so does fuel continuity. And higher fuel continuity allows for the continued ignition and combustion of fuels, which creates a greater reduction in fuels after the treatment. Now, we didn't have any measure of fuel continuity, so this is somewhat speculation, but this relationship has been described elsewhere in the literature. Now, pivoting towards our modeled fire effects, let's look at trees first. FFE slightly overestimated the mortality of overstory trees for all species, though none of the model estimates for stand density and basal area were significantly different from our observed data. And you can see this in the graphs on the right. The upper one shows it shows live tree density by species, and the bottom shows live basal area by species. And the orange plot is observed pre-treatment, yellow is observed post, and blue is modeled post-treatment. Curiously, while tree mortality was slightly overpredicted, scorch heights were actually underpredicted by FFE. Tree mortality equations that underlie these FFE predictions incorporate scorch height as a predictor of mortality. And what these findings suggest is that the species in our plots are actually more tolerant of higher scorch heights without being killed. Looking at regeneration data now, you'll remember that in the observed data set, we could break this into seedlings, saplings, and resprouts. But unfortunately, FFE groups all of these in their outputs, which limits our comparison in some ways. But when we look at this data grouped, we see that FFE underestimated the regeneration density of redwood. And it appears that the prolific resprouting we saw with redwood doesn't seem to be well captured by the model. And you can see that in the bottom line here of that table on the left. When it comes to fuels, FFE was less accurate at estimating change after the burn treatments. This violin plot on the bottom right shows duff fuels on the top left, litter and fine woody fuels on the top right, coarse woody fuels on the bottom left, and surface fuels on the bottom right. FFE significantly underestimated the reduction in duff, but significantly overestimated the reduction in litter and fine woody fuels, which you'll remember is consistent with that past research that found exactly the same thing. Model estimates for the change in coarse woody debris were pretty much accurate, but due to the overestimation of litter reduction, FFE also overestimated the reduction in surface and total fuels. Finally, we used the probability of torching as a measurement of treatment effectiveness in this study. And this is an FFE output that estimates the probability that fire will move from the forest floor up into the forest canopy, given site and weather conditions. We modeled this under severe wildfire conditions using the parameters shown here on the top right, and that is a temperature of 95 degrees, winds of 45 miles per hour, and very dry fuel moistures. And these numbers weren't pulled out of a hat. We actually defined these conditions using data from the Ben Lomond Ross station during the 2020 CZU lightning complex fire to represent real world conditions that we could, reasonably expect to see in the future. Before the prescribed burn, the mean probability of torching was very low. It was 14% under these severe conditions. And after the burn, it dropped down to 6%. Though the difference between these two scenarios were not statistically significant. We know that this slight reduction in fire intensity is primarily due to the reduction in surface fuels, because there's virtually no difference in forest structure and composition between either data set. And while this may seem reassuring that the probability of torching is relatively low under extreme conditions, we did see passive crown fire in large areas of the Wallbridge fires and CZU lightning complex fire, which suggests that FFE may be underestimating fire behavior in these severe conditions. And one potential explanation of this is the flammability of redwood bark. Now, fire readily climbs up the fibrous bark of redwoods and can carry fire high up into the canopy, allowing for the preheating and drying of live canopy fuels, potentially making them more available to burn. This is two photos of this happening during the Grove of Old Trees operation. Overnight, actually, during really mild burning conditions. And to give you a sense of scale here, the trees in these photos are about 2 to 3 meters in diameter and 50 to 60 meters tall. So they're pretty large trees. And this phenomenon is also compounded by basal cavities, often burning out and casting embers into the forest canopy. And taken together, these unique burning characteristics allow for the possibility of vertical fire spread in redwoods through convective heating and spotting, even under mild conditions, and are not well represented by fire spread models in FFE. There are also a few other potential drivers of model inaccuracy when used in these cooler, wetter settings. When it comes to tree mortality, some of the inaccuracies could be due to a few reasons. First is FFE uses generalized bark thickness values for all species that are relatively thin, which could be potentially inflating tree mortality estimates. Also, in these cooler, wetter settings, the observed burn effects were typically patchier and more discontinuous than the assumed uniformity within FFE. And finally, equations within FFE that are used to estimate resprouting rates do not incorporate fire severity as a driver, which past research has found is a key predictor of sprouting for redwoods. When it comes to inaccuracies in fuels estimates, there are two key aspects of FFE's fuel calculation that could be an issue. First, FFE simplifies the relationship between fuel moisture and fuel consumption for all fuel classes. And to give you a sense of what this looks like, FFE assumes that regardless of fuel moisture content, litter will be consumed 100%, 1 in 10 hour fuels will be consumed 90%, and 100-hour fuels will be consumed 65%. Again, regardless of fuel moisture, which we know is a vast oversimplification of that relationship. Also, canopy fuel deposition rates likely don't capture the interannual variability. So when we have periods of high deposition associated with storms, that is probably not well represented by the model. So future research on FFE model verification would benefit from testing the model against prescribed fires conducted across a spectrum of weather and fuel moisture scenarios to really parse out whether these inaccuracies are unique to this forest type and these species, or these cooler weather conditions, or potentially both. For forest managers looking to incorporate or expand the use of fire in their restoration and stewardship efforts, this research provides a couple key points of guidance. First is, in order for prescribed fire to create meaningful reductions in stand density, fire practitioners likely need to burn at moderate to high intensities. That means burning under conditions similar to or drier than the one shown here at the top. And you'll remember these are the desired conditions as defined in that burn plan. So at this threshold or drier will probably yield the results you're looking for. Also, waiting at least 2 weeks since the last rainfall would likely help managers by allowing enough time for those woody fuels to dry out enough to become available to burn. Repeated fire treatments may allow managers to achieve some of these fuel and stand reduction goals, but our regression model suggests that sufficient fuel loading and continuity will be necessary to produce the fire intensity needed to yield these results. As successive burn treatments consume fuels, overall fuel continuity will decrease, thereby limiting the intensity of subsequent burns. And it's for this reason that burning under hotter, drier conditions will likely produce desirable effects better than repeated cool, wet burns. Lastly, managers may also want to consider pairing their fire treatments with mechanical thinning to achieve those density reduction goals, especially mortality of non-redwood species. Our study and past research suggests that overstory trees will not be killed by prescribed fire alone. And where it is feasible, thinning treatments can be used to restore structural complexity in these forests. So also looking into the future, we must make sure that our fire restoration efforts serve to support Indigenous fire initiatives. And we recognize that this research was limited in this respect by not including Indigenous and tribal partners, but it's our hope that future efforts incorporate the guidance offered by Indigenous scholars and practitioners in the field. And I just want to draw our attention to a recent publication entitled Indigenous Fire Futures, led by Denise Martinez at UC Davis, which provides a vision for this work moving forward. And I'll just read an excerpt from this paper. And they write, Indigenous cultural fire practices are distinct from other controlled fire uses because relationships among land and community are at the forefront of how practitioners prioritize sites for burning. It is not enough to simply learn from Indigenous people and apply their knowledge. This tactic is settler colonialism at work and directly supports settler futures of erasure, appropriation, and replacement. The integration of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science will reproduce colonial relations of power and property and result in further dispossession unless it is partnered with structural changes, such as the rematriation of Indigenous lands and redistribution of resources towards Indigenous fire initiatives. As the ongoing resurgence of Indigenous fire practitioners builds momentum, there are numerous opportunities for generative collaborative research that centers Indigenous fire futures. Ultimately, Indigenous peoples have sovereign rights and responsibilities that will precede and outlast the settler colonial state of California. So with that, I want to take an opportunity to thank the many people who made this project possible. First, thanks to my academic advisors, Dr. Miranda Redmond, Dr. Scott Stevens, and Dr. Brandon Collins. Thank you also to Save the Redwoods League, Audubon Canyon Ranch, CAL FIRE, and UC Berkeley for your generous financial support. Thanks most of all to my partner, Michelle, for your unending encouragement, to my coworkers at Point Blue, Sophie, Libby, and Bonnie, who have been so flexible these last few years. Thanks to Sasha and Brian and the whole Fire Forward team for your help bridging the applied and academic worlds of fire ecology. Thanks also to Land Paths and Tim Highland at California State Parks for access to our study sites, and to Ashley, Tessa, and Joe for sharing your knowledge and data. Thanks also to all my lab mates here for all the good times the last few years, and the many folks who have helped with data collection, and especially to the Good Fire Alliance community, which I am continually honored and inspired to be a part of. So for those interested, here is a list of references. This is the best part right here. And yeah, happy to take any questions you have.
I'll ask one.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about your fuel moisture measurements, you said your 10-hour fuel moisture is 17.6%, which is really interesting because if you're in the Sierra Nevada, you can't get anything burned.
That shouldn't be flammable, right?
No, it shouldn't be flammable at all. It's really interesting. That tells you the litter is incredibly flammable.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you said that the study showed no real difference in fine fuel load and could have some deposition because of all the storms. But I bet you it's more just the consumption of the litter and the duct because it's available and it's actually able to burn. That's an extraordinarily high fuel moisture to have that consumption.
Yeah. You know, I think the variability in fuel moistures for all fuel classes was much greater than I expected. There's past research by Bob Martin and Mark Finney that describe the bulk density of litter and duff obviously increases with depth, and logically the fuel moisture content should also increase with depth. And that might seem simple, but what that means in real terms is that the top layer is potentially available to burn, but just a couple centimeters below that top layer, it might be not available. And I wish we had I wish we had collected fuel moisture samples in a way to test that a little bit more. Because that variability could just be due to, oh, we pulled some litter that was just slightly deeper than other areas, and as a result, the variability is huge, and it might be swaying it more towards the wetter end, like the wetter end of the population, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I thought this was really great talk. I'm curious, do you think that this is more for the need to create more specific inputs or dynamics for models, or to create better descriptions about what a model is not?
I think both. Yeah. For folks on Zoom, the question was, do we need to make models better, or have there be disclaimers on things like FFE? I think we could make these models better, and a way to do that would be including managers' input. Not only managers on the ground, but people who utilize this tool. As with other models, I think people who use them come up with kind of rules of thumb, like they understand the limitations and the strengths of it, and that isn't necessarily common knowledge. So if that like nuanced understanding could be put in as a disclaimer or used to improve the model. Improving something like FFE is really hard because it spans the entire continental US. And there's different regional variants that are unique to sites, but maybe not even specific enough to really specific sites. A yes and it depends kind of answer. So sorry. What?
That feel like at all, like let's say I'm a land manager and I kind of want to do how do I play around with that specific part that we get maybe more accurate predictions about what.
Yeah, absolutely. For folks on Zoom, the question was which fuel models did we use in our analysis, and how would people go about selecting those? So actually, I didn't include this in the study, but part of this paper includes a fuel model decision matrix that we developed, and it's based on Scott and Bergen's method for selecting fuel models, but gets a little bit more specific to this forest type. So We consider like what is the dominant fuel that's being burned, as well as what are the understory, like how much of the understory is dominated by live vegetation versus dead fuel. What's the like relative dominance of conifer versus non-conifer, and then what are litter and coarse woody fuel loads like. But generally the 7 we ended up with are all timber understory and timber litter. And there, as with selecting any fuel model, you don't just go based on what the absolute values are for each fuel class. And they even say in Scott and Bergen, you should select your model based on observed fire behavior. So we didn't incorporate in this study like which of these models best predicts fire behavior in these plots, partly because we weren't able to collect fire behavior observations within each plot. It's generalized values for a whole operation. But that would be a great expansion on this kind of work.
Do you feel like these are reflective, maybe sort of the big
Yeah, they were representative, the fuel bed characteristics, though the relative fuel loads in each class varied quite a bit more. Like there were plots with a ton of coarse woody debris, and there was no model that represented that very well. And then there was, and these models don't even incorporate duff, but a huge portion of fuel loads in redwoods is within that duff layer. So it's hard to know which model to pick when none of them even consider duff at all. And you might argue, well, duff doesn't really get consumed, but our study showed that half of the duff was consumed, despite that it even being like pretty wet. So why that is and how to incorporate that into your decision making is going to be difficult, and I think a lot of it will be trial and error. Oh, lots of questions online. Question: did the old growth trees that we're torching survive? Yes, they totally did. And like their overstory was still green. I will say there were some suppression efforts to get up there and get water on the trees because of the possibility of spotting outside the unit. But yes, those trees are totally fine. This is kind of a lot to read all at once. Yeah. Other questions from the room? Or does someone want to read the questions here? And okay. Yeah. Do you think that trees that experience more burns under normal conditions would have more like char on the boles and wouldn't carry fire up the boles? Yes, that is a really good point, actually. So these first entry burns, the reason fire is carrying so high into the canopy is because there's no char on that bole at all. And once it's burned once, it's harder to get that charred bark to burn again. So my guess is you would see fire climbing high into the canopy in those first entries, and then after that point, it would become more limited. And also with each burn, you're like reducing the bark load on each tree, so there's less fuel to carry the fire up into the tree. Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, I think we'll end it there. Thanks everyone online.
How about we take a few minutes of break, maybe?